Imagine being caught up in the fastest urban growth imaginable and having to invent and build a city and be proud to live in. A city that 700 years later would still be unsurpassed. Between 1200 and 1350, in a small area of Central Italy, the world changed forever. 800 years after the collapse of the Roman Empire, Europe's dark ages were coming to an end. New ideas and opportunities were taking life in new directions. Cities, commerce, the visual arts, religion, and our understanding of ourselves would never be the same. This was the dawn of the Renaissance, the first light of the modern Western world. For generations, the center of life in Tuscany, as in all of Europe, had been the farm. But now trade was booming. More opportunities were opening up to more people than ever before, and a new kind of life was possible. A life with work and wages. A life in the city. Cities were growing throughout Europe, but especially in central Italy. Not since the city of Rome had fallen to Germanic invaders in the 5th century had so many people been living so close together. Florence and Siena had grown to become the two great rival powers of central Italy. They were, in fact, city-states with armies and territorial ambitions that we associate today with nations, not cities. They fought constantly through the 12 and 1300s, vying for military, economic, and artistic supremacy. In Siena, the walls enclosed just twice the space of New York's Central Park. Yet in the 1300s, this city was at the forefront of Western civilization, with a population of about 52,000. At the same time, London had a population of only 40,000.
Medieval cities, like modern cities, grew from an original core, which in many cases went back to Roman times. What really caused the extraordinary explosion of cities in the 12 and 1300s in central Italy was what today historians often call an industrial revolution of the Middle Ages. Cities like Florence, in fact, developed industry, here the wool-producing industry, to such an extent that they really needed ever greater numbers of men and women from the countryside to come into town to work in the factories. This meant that the original core grew, and grew in concentric rings around the center. Those rings were originally outside the city walls, and therefore deprived of the kinds of services that medieval cities could give. One of the most important of these was religious services. A church in which to hear Mass, priests to baptize children, to accompany the elderly to their deathbed, and so on. New religious orders sprang up in the early 1200s, the so-called poor orders, mendicant orders like the Franciscans, to live outside the city walls in these new quarters or neighborhoods of the city that had grown up to accommodate the industrial workers coming in from the countryside. These orders created small chapels which in the course of a generation or two needed to grow because the population grew, because those people had become more prosperous, because the very factory owners who employed these people contributed to what they saw as a clear social service, contributed to the work of the mendicant orders, making it possible handsome new churches. In Florence, for example, all around the old center of the city, we see the magnificent churches begun in the later 12th and early 1300s of these mendicant orders. The biggest of them is the Franciscan Church, Santa Croce, which even today looms above. You have exactly the same configuration of the cities elsewhere, not only in Siena and other central Italian cities, but in London, in Paris, in the German cities. You find the same pattern. The old center with its cathedral, the new periphery with the very big and handsome churches of the religious orders corresponding to the maximal moment of urban growth at the end of the Middle Ages between the 13th and the 15th centuries.
Today, most Western governments separate the roles of church and state. In the 12 and 1300s, religion was woven integrally into the fabric of life in the new cities. In Italy, as in the rest of Europe, virtually everyone belonged to the Roman Catholic Church, and the Christian moral responsibility of helping those less fortunate was taken seriously. The newly wealthy middle class began to form religious brotherhoods or confraternities to fund and operate orphanages, schools, and hospitals. Many of these, such as the Misericordia in Florence and Santa Maria della Scala in Siena, survive today. Religion was also at the heart of urban life in the form of the city's most important building, the cathedral. In Florence and Siena, these architectural marvels are referred to as the Duomo, for their impressive domes, which still dominate the city's skylines.
Cathedrals in Italian medieval city-states were a bit like missile programs in modern democracies. They were strongly competitive. The enormous scale of the Florence Cathedral, for example, was explicitly requested in the document which commissioned the church from its first architect, Arnolfo di Cambio, in 1296. The Florentines wanted, they said, the biggest church in all of Tuscany. And this certainly for a reason. They knew that the neighboring city-state, Siena, which had brutally defeated Florence on the field of battle 36 years earlier, in 1260 at the Battle of Montaperti, had used part of Florence's war reparations to enlarge and embellish its cathedral with magnificent works of sculpture and later then of painting. Florence in 1296 wanted to show that it had come back in force, and so it began to build what, when it was finally finished in the 15th century, would be in its time the biggest covered space in the world, as far as we know, certainly in all of Europe. Bigger than the old version even of St. Peter's in Rome. The sheer scale of Florence Cathedral, 153 meters long. The height from the pavement to the opening of the lantern, 90 meters. With bays, the architectural arched openings here in the principal nave that are the widest in all of Europe, 18 meters square. In Notre Dame in Paris, the bays are perhaps 6 meters from pilaster to pilaster. Here, 3 times that. All of that meant to express the power of the city, its prestige, its capacity to use human knowledge in a way that could serve man and God. This was considered wisdom. The engineering skills that went into building a church of this sort really were part of the practical wisdom that the church saw its members receiving among God's many blessings. The scale of these buildings, though, as well as their richness of decoration, very much a part of the message they were meant to communicate.
Cathedrals symbolized a city's wealth, strength, sophistication, and artistic achievement. Florence set itself a major task to build a cathedral that would outdo the Duomo of Siena. Building bigger was one thing. Exceeding the quality of painting and sculpture in Siena's cathedral was another. The Sienese believed that the Virgin Mary had answered their prayers when they defeated the Florentines in the Battle of Montaperti. The cathedral was their offering to her, a lavish gift of thanks made in the hope of continued peace and prosperity. Other important buildings in Siena were built of brick, but the city wanted to cover the cathedral in marble and a dazzling array of sculpture. It turned to a father and son from Pisa, whose work for the Duomo of Siena set a new standard for centuries to come.
It's possible to say that sculpture underwent a renaissance even before painting. If the great moments in painting are really at the end of the 13th century, already in the middle of the 13th century, 1260, we have some of the greatest sculpture of the period being made. And the people to watch are Nicola Pisano and his son Giovanni. And people watched them, people employed them all over Italy. They originated from Pisa, and that's important because in Pisa was one of the greatest holdings of the relief sculpture of Roman antiquity. This was their school, and you can see the influence of that Roman sculpture in their work very palpably.
Niccolo's inspiration was sculpture found on ancient stone coffins, Roman sarcophagi. Not only did he master the complex and tightly packed style of antique composition, he found something deeper.
What these reliefs do is give you a wide array of expressions of emotions of various kinds. And Pisano does it at the level of the greatest Roman sculptors. This was something that Michelangelo recognized and appreciated in this distant forebear of his.
The achievement of Niccolo's pulpit inside Siena Cathedral is matched by the work of his son Giovanni on the exterior. His Old Testament prophets and other biblical figures have been inspiring sculptors for more than 700 years.
The tourist of today is actually quite lucky because there are copies of the sculptures up on the facade, so you can see the effect that they were meant to have. But if you go next door to the Museo dell'Opera del Duomo, you can see the real works having been somewhat abraded by the elements, but still very much there. And you can see to what extent Giovanni Pisano worked to make his sculptures powerful from a distance. So you'll notice if you look at them closely that he leaves really raw drill holes in the hair, for example, of his prophets, because he knows these sculptures are going to be seen from far away, and he wants them to have a kind of legibility, a kind of powerful quality from a distance. And you can also see in those sculptures in the museum how far outward they project, especially from the neck up. They really crane their necks because, of course, from below, if they don't do that, we would have their heads sort of obscured by their shoulders. But with the heads projecting out, we can really see the faces.
To find the best sculptors, the city fathers of Siena had to go to Pisa to hire Niccolo and Giovanni Pisano. The best painters, however, were right within the city walls. The cathedral was the city's most important building, and it was to be a showcase for the most audacious new work by the best artists of Siena.
In the 14th century, Siena commissioned a series of altarpieces for the cathedral, and these are an incredibly important moment in the history of art. And the first great altarpiece for the church, and the greatest one still, is Duccio's Maestà. It's completely innovative in every way. It's just the largest altarpiece of its kind from the period. It's an extraordinary thing, and the Sienese immediately appreciated it. When it was finished, they carried it in procession from Duccio's studio to the cathedral. They were so proud of it. You could say it's like the Sistine ceiling, and it's exactly 200 years earlier, 1308, 1311. And Michelangelo had done his Sistine ceiling in 1508 to 1511.
Siena was in the forefront of new developments in art, as Paris was in the 19th century or New York in the late 20th. The city's best painters were breaking new ground, freeing themselves from the flat formality of the Byzantine style, a world without action and emotion that had been standard in painting for 8 centuries. Their work for the cathedral was at the leading edge of the new naturalistic style, depicting a world with 3 dimensions, figures with a sense of motion and psychological depth. Duccio's Virgin in Majesty, or Maestà in Italian, shows Mary as the Queen of Heaven, surrounded by a court of angels and saints. Their gently rounded bodies, harmonious variety of poses, and the delicacy and skill with which they are painted were revolutionary. As were the scenes depicted on a series of small panels on the back of the altarpiece. From the Annunciation through the Resurrection and the freeing of souls from limbo, each panel tells a dramatic story of an episode in the life of Christ. The Maestà set a high standard for Siena's next civic painting commissions, which proved equally revolutionary. The ability of painting to tell stories, not just to depict an array of heavenly beings, was becoming increasingly important. As in Assisi, where on the walls of the Basilica of San Francesco in the 1280s and 90s, 28 huge frescoes were painted in the new naturalistic style to tell the story of the life of St. Francis. This same drive toward narrative storytelling is found 2 decades later in the Maestà and in the other commissions for altarpieces for Siena's cathedral.
The 4 altarpieces that were designed to complement the Maestà were unusual and innovative. They showed scenes from the life of the Virgin, actually in sequence. And this was very unusual up until this point, and including the Maestà, altarpieces showed saints in ranks. But here, in these 4 paintings by Simone Martini, the Lorenzetti brothers, and Bulgarini, we have narrative subjects imported into the center of altarpieces. And this is a great moment in the history of easel painting, really. This is the beginning of modern easel painting. Really, what's happened in these altarpieces is a kind of narrative painting that was developed in fresco has been transposed to panel. Fresco painting is mural painting on wet plaster, and it was used to decorate many, many wall surfaces in churches throughout Italy in this period. Panel painting is, you could say, the upstart here, and it's undergoing radical changes every decade. And this cycle of altarpieces is one of those milestones where we see panel painting assuming new challenges, taking on new tasks. You can see that the different artists take different approaches to it. This is untested territory. So Pietro Lorenzetti, for example, in his Birth of the Virgin, pretty much uses fresco painting style. It's very episodic. You don't see gold ground practically anywhere. He represents an interior. Simone Martini, in his Annunciation, rather, is much more, you could say, respectful of the altarpiece tradition. He shows you a narrative subject, but he's insistent about its miraculous qualities. For one thing, we have gold ground covering most of the painting. So although this is a historical subject, it happened at a specific time, he's taking it out of time. He's really relating it to the repeated rituals that go on inside a church. This is the moment where the angel says Ave Maria, which is, of course, one of the principal prayers in Christian life.
The rich gold background looks back to Byzantine tradition, but Simone Martini is telling the story with action and even words. He depicts the angel's arrival and greeting to the Virgin, Ave Maria, or Hail Mary. These would have been the same words with which worshippers in the cathedral, kneeling in front of his painting, would have begun their own prayers. The Virgin's sense of fear and surprise at the arrival of the angel were also new and striking. In the early 15th century, San Bernardino of Siena, a charismatic preacher, missionary, and opponent of vice and luxury, told the young women of Siena to model themselves on the modesty and humility of the Virgin as we see her here. Beauty, particularly beauty that could inspire virtue, was a primary consideration in the building and decoration of the cathedral. As it was for all civic projects, how buildings, streets, and public spaces looked was as important as how well they were built. The rulers of Siena were particularly concerned with the appearance of their city. In 1334, they paid 2 officials specifically to oversee its beauty. There was a judge of streets and 3 officials to assist him to see that buildings did not encroach on streets or merchants' counters obstruct traffic. In 1346, the city also appointed an official to supervise and regulate the new construction. It redounds to the beauty of the city of Siena that any edifices that are made in view anywhere along the public thoroughfares shall be disposed and arranged to be of the greatest beauty for the city. The town hall, or Palazzo Pubblico, built by the city council itself, established the standards.
During the 13th century, the city-states of Tuscany began to build town halls. These magnificent structures served many functions, not the least of which was a testament to the power and the pride and the magnificence of the communes that built them. The level of civic pride invested in these new buildings was every bit as equal as the level of the pride devoted to the great cathedral building campaigns of the same era. Structures such as the Palazzo Pubblico in Siena are glorious testaments to the evolution of democracies during this very exciting period of urban history, when democratic governments began to take the place of rule by the church. These fledgling democracies wanted and needed monumental seats of government that would make a strong visual statement, and they were fully willing to commit the resources, both time and money, to ensure that they were built. Once town halls began to appear, they formed a second focal point inside the walls of the city, the cathedrals being the first focal point. The town halls were not just the administrative center of the city. In front of the town hall would be a large open square or piazza, where markets were held, where people could meet to walk and talk and exchange the local gossip. This was also an area where civic spectacles, public events would be staged. The Piazza del Campo is one of the most beautiful public squares in the world. From a document of 1297, we know that the City Council of Siena, the Nove, were concerned not just with building the most beautiful town hall in Tuscany, but also with the way in which this building, the Palazzo Pubblico, would fit into its immediate urban surroundings. They decreed that any building built around the Piazza del Campo would have the same types of windows as the Palazzo Pubblico, that is, without balconies and with columns. This would ensure that all of the buildings around the Campo would have a similar aesthetic appearance and could form a cohesive visual unit.
Cohesiveness in government was more difficult to achieve than cohesiveness in architecture. The divisions of national, regional, and local authority that exist today were not established. Italy was not a country, but a collection of often warring states. In some, the ultimate authority was the Church. In others, it was the Holy Roman Emperor. In 800, Pope Leo III had granted this title to Charlemagne, a German king, in thanks for defending his rights to the papacy. Throughout the next 8 centuries, German princes would vie for the title, battling popes for the right to control the territories that had once belonged to the Roman Empire. In this political turmoil and confusion, establishing governments to run the new city-states was no easy task. Roads, housing, water, sanitation, crime, and feuding noble families were major problems for the new city-states. The nobility's wealth was their agricultural holdings and villas in the country. For them, the city was a playground and a battlefield. As city magistrates, nobles made legal decisions that blatantly favored their own kin. Age-old family vendettas erupting in street violence were a fact of city life. Many noble houses within the cities were essentially fortresses, complete with defensive towers. All of this had a bad effect on the city-based businesses of the new merchant class. Something dramatic had to be done to establish order, to resolve feuds amongst the nobility, to make and enforce laws, and take control of the chaos of urban life. Siena and Florence took a revolutionary step. In the late 1200s, their governments passed from the nobility to the new middle class.
The urban traders feel that they are not treated with sufficient respect by the rural nobles who control the cities. So the urban merchants felt that they were continually disadvantaged by rural-based nobility. The rural nobles, quite logically, when it came to law courts, when it came to taxes, would favor their own situation. And what you found is that merchants wanted to have a form of government, a form of law, that would protect their interests, protect their rights. They couldn't really get this in the rural setting that existed beforehand. Now, what they can get, though, and what a number of them do get, is charters which allow them to set up as a commune or a commune. And the idea of a commune, again, is people working together. So a commune would develop as a political body when a group of merchants decided that they could gather together, gain a charter for their town, a charter from say, the emperor. This is, for instance, what Siena gets. When Siena gets its charter, and on the basis of that charter, the charter would grant them the right to govern themselves, grant them often the right to make coinage, to have an economy, and grant them the right to rule over an area around the city. They can only hold this power if they act collectively. And so the commune is always this middle range of people, merchants, artisans, traders, who work collectively in order to defend their rights, set up courts that defend their rights. In many cases, in many cities like Florence, pass laws which limit the power of rural nobles. Rural nobles, for instance, are effectively disenfranchised. At the peak of Siena's power, from the late 13th century to the middle of the 14th century, it's governed by a city council called the Council of Nine. The members of the Council of Nine were chosen from out of a larger body, Council of 300. And you can imagine the Council of Nine as being like the city council or the cabinet of Siena. What's different, though, is that those councillors only served for 2-month terms because you couldn't be trusted to hold power for more than 2 months. When you were a serving member of the Council of Nine, you lived in City Hall because they didn't trust you to go back to your own house and possibly work with your neighbors to somehow defraud the commune. So, incredible lack of trust in each other, but then the result was a set of government structures built up that would allow everybody to participate.
Siena's Council of Nine, called the Nove from the Italian for nine, built the Palazzo Pubblico as the seat of their government, their home while in office, and the embodiment of their aspirations for the city. This is particularly evident in the Sala di Nove, the meeting room of the council. In 1338 and 39, 3 frescoes were painted by Ambrogio Lorenzetti, one of Siena's leading painters, depicting the goals and concerns of the Nove. 200 years before what we think of as the Renaissance, these are among the first large-scale paintings created since the fall of the Roman Empire that do not deal with a religious subject.
These paintings in the Sala di Nove are extraordinarily legible, and that's one of their great virtues. You can stand in this room and just read them off the wall. For example, in the allegory of bad government, we have very nasty-looking tyranny, who's the largest figure of all, enthroned in the center, with a kind of anti-trinity of vices hovering above him: avarice, pride, and vainglory. And then seated to either side are various other disreputable characters. We have cruelty, we have treason. You can see that treason is holding a lamb, which looks nice from the front, but it has a kind of serpent's tail in the back that you don't see so easily. And then on the other side of tyranny, you have fury. And then next to fury is division. And division is wearing the black and white of Siena and is sawing herself in half. One side of her garment says si, the other side says no. Yes and no, never able to reconcile. And then the last figure on the right is the figure of war. You can see that it says guerra, war, on the figure's shield.
And the effects of bad government? Timor. Fear rules over a war-ravaged city and the surrounding countryside. A woman is being threatened by soldiers. Houses are falling down. The land is in flames. But bad government was what the Nove strove to avoid. Their approach to good government is described in the allegory that dominates the room.
In the upper part of the fresco, there is a clearly identified figure, a woman with her name above her, Sapientia, wisdom. So good government has to come out of an initial situation of wisdom. Below wisdom, we see a phrase in Latin that everyone would have understood. It is the opening phrase of the Old Testament Book of Wisdom. The phrase is, Diligite justitiam qui judicatis terram. Love justice, you who govern the earth. A clear invitation to those who in this room, in the town hall, will formulate the programs of the city-state of Siena, that they should first of all love justice. From wisdom, therefore, the invitation to love justice, and right below this phrase, a beautiful young woman who is a figure of justice. A woman with scales growing from her head, that is to say, balancing scales, and on the two plates of the scales, then, we see both distributive and commutative justice. The giving out of prizes or of punishments, the wiping away of debts, of obligations, of punishments. Below justice, a third woman is seated. The Middle Ages used women for allegory. The third woman, coming out of wisdom and justice, is a figure of concord, concordia, harmony, and it is civil harmony. She is shown with an architect's level on her knees. The purpose of that justice born of wisdom that seeks social harmony is to create a certain equality, to level out the differences that create resentments, that create rancor among the different classes of a society.
Around the king, the symbol of Siena, are the cardinal virtues that bring discipline to society. Peace, fortitude, and temperance. Above these are the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity. With these allegorical figures, Ambrogio Lorenzetti embodied the ideals of Christian good government. His fresco tells us that the city council who met in this chamber were looking beyond the personal, beyond politics, to universal values of goodness to inspire their decisions. In principle, individual goodness and virtue were enough to rule the city. In practice, the city fathers were wise enough to know that enforced public regulation was the only way to ensure security and peace. As early as the 1250s, Siena had 860 civic officials, including 171 night watchmen to regulate a city of roughly 15,000. In less than 100 years, the population would more than triple. For those just arrived from the country, without farm chores to occupy every hour, there was ample opportunity for trouble. So many temptations: luxury goods, food, drink, gambling, sex, As the city grew, the regime of the Nove added new laws and regulations, new committees, officials, and clerks to document every aspect of city life. The State Archives of Siena is a treasure trove of minutely detailed information about daily life in the city. From its hundreds of thousands of documents, we know that there was virtually no part of city life that was not legislated. There were official weights and measures for the sale of goods within the city. The size of bricks was legislated to ensure architectural uniformity and harmony. There were government-controlled brothels. There was a night curfew. There were also sumptuary laws, dictating what clothing and jewelry could be worn by people of specific social standing. These laws were designed by the new middle-class city government to prevent the nobility from appearing rich and powerful to the public. The church also supported sumptuary laws that curbed luxuriousness that could lead to moral decay. Realizing the inevitable, the city fathers also set fines for when these laws were inevitably broken. All of this new legislation and regulation was without precedent. The city was literally inventing itself. This is Siena's Constitution of 1309. It signals major changes in government and in daily life. It attests to the high degree of literacy in the city. It tells us that all citizens were equal before the law, and that they had a right to access and to read the laws by which they were governed. The notion of public process, of decisions being made in a fair and democratic way and recorded for public review, became central to government and civic institutions, such as the Misericordia in Florence, a brotherhood or confraternity that still exists today.
We are in the modern institutional headquarters of the Confraternity of Mercy. In the 16th century, these more modern headquarters were built, and this is where even today the members of the Confraternity of Mercy meet. And we've come into the principal meeting hall, what's called the Corpo Generale, the general body, where members from different branches of the confraternity come to vote upon the issues that come before the brotherhood. And they're the issues that any modern confraternity would have. They're issues of the kind that these people have voted on since the 1200s and have voted in the same way. The tables in front of the benches have these small containers with black and white balls. The members of the group who are present take each the color ball that he wants. Black means yes, white means no. And so if I'm voting against something, I would take a white ball, and then as the ushers pass, for each question, a separate voting is done,